Believe it or not, we are halfway through this decade, so I'm going to give my picks for my top 10 favorite films that have come out in the first half of the 2020s. Keyword favorite. This is not a best of list. This is completely subjective, just the films that I have personally loved from the past several years. That said, this was a really difficult list to finalize because some of my favorite films of all time have released in the past several years, and so here are all of my honorable mentions. I could have easily made this a top 20 list, but here are some other pickings from this decade that I really enjoyed and thoroughly recommend. Now, in just this decade, there have been 5 really solid Christmas Carol movies released. And while I love Spirited and VHS Christmas Carol, number 10 on my list is going to be Jefferson May's one-man Broadway show that was filmed and released in 2020. One-man tellings of A Christmas Carol have been around for a century and a half. It's an important part of the history of the story, and they were able to enhance May's performance with so many great modern theatrics that keep it really interesting. Number 9 is Elemental. So many aspects of this film really capture the feeling of early Pixar films, and I've rewatched it so many times. I genuinely don't understand why people say this is a bad film. I think that the people who hated on it just are so jaded from the past couple of years that they don't allow themselves to enjoy a good story. And I love that while it is clearly a story that is personal to director Peter Sohn, it's still relatable in a lot of different ways for many groups of people. Number 8 is In the Heights. This one is so frustrating because this could have been the best movie adaptation of a musical if they had left the story alone. This film does more than most movie musicals at actually adapting it to film, like adding in framing devices that make it more acceptable for film, doing things that you couldn't do on stage. The cinematography and the acting and the choreography and the music are all great. I just am really frustrated by a lot of the changes they made to some of the plot points and character relationships. It's still a really solid film, and I actually think the cast recording is better than the original Broadway one. Number 7 is Coup, a indie film that I got a screener for last year, and I'm really glad I did because I probably wouldn't have seen it otherwise. The film is set during the 1918 influenza outbreak, but it's very clearly an analogy and commentary on the COVID pandemic. I just love the way that they were able to portray a lot of the frustrations that essential workers had to go through during the pandemic. Number 6 is Cabrini, a film about Francesco Cabrini that was released by Angel Studios last year. The reason I love this film is because it's a really candid and realistic look at Italophobia that was prevalent in the late 19th century, something that my ancestors would have had to deal with. And despite it being the real story of a Catholic missionary, the film is actually deceptively progressive in a lot of its messaging, but a lot of people just write it off because it's an Angel Studios film. Number 5 is Spider-Man No Way Home, which is much more than novelty fan service. Somehow they made the 6th MCU film to feature Spider-Man be his origin story, and the inclusion of the other Spider-Man are necessary to Peter's arc, and you couldn't tell this story any other way. Number 4 is Encanto. There was this beautiful moment in early 2022 where Encanto was such a huge cultural phenomenon, and it really felt like it was going to be the next Frozen. And I'm really sad that the hype died down because it's still a genuinely good film with themes and great animation and characters and music. And when you compare films like this to the Disney films from like the 50s, it's incredible how much more layered and nuanced it is. Number 3 is Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, an adaptation of a book from 1970, which is a very realistic coming-of-age story that deals pretty candidly with the subject of female puberty as well as finding one's faith. I was blown away with how well they were able to portray these subjects despite these being things that I haven't gone through, but the performances and the screenplay really help you to feel those things with the characters. And that's also just a really solid period piece, no pun intended. The production design makes it look like how it did in the 70s. Number 2 is Turtles All the Way Down, the film adaptation to John Green's young adult novel. This film is by far the best depiction and representation of mental illness I have ever seen. As someone with ADHD and autism spectrum myself, I really related to it and it felt very personal. And there was a scene, and if you've seen it, you probably know which one, that made me have the most visceral emotional experience I have ever had watching a film. I was sobbing during this scene. And I'd read the book twice before, but I never had the same kind of emotional connection to the characters that I did when I'm watching this film. I'm going to throw in 2 more honorable mentions, one being for Hamilton, because the Pro Shot was released in 2020, but I was thoroughly familiar with the show before 2020, and WandaVision, which is by far my favorite thing that Marvel Studios has ever made, but I'm only excluding it for pedantic reasons because it's technically a mini-series, not a film. But if these 2 were on the list, they would be in the top 3. This is going to be very anticlimactic, but my number 1 film of the decade and my number 1 film of all time is Luca. If you know anything about me, you know how much I love this film. I've literally made dozens of videos about this movie. Simply put, the reason that it's my favorite film is because of just the peace and the comfort that I feel when I watch it. Obviously, this has been a very hard several years, and Luca has just been my escape and my comfort film throughout all of that. And I just love the simplicity of the characters and the story and the beautiful Italian setting. I literally blew all of my savings last year so I could go to Italy because I fell in love with the landscape because of this film. And I will continue to rant until the day I die about Disney releasing it on Disney+. Let me know your favorite films from this decade and if there's any that you think I might like that I missed.